the Mississippi River.
The Mississippi River.
The Mississippi River, this is also incredible, has hit historic low levels due to the current drought.
The Mississippi River is often called America's vital artery. Now, that artery is being clogged by those who tried to control it.
The climate crisis is also top of mind for many voters. The Mississippi River is at historically low levels, which could impact the food supply and our wallets.
Barges are getting stranded, saltwater is rushing inland, and nature is being destroyed.
A U.S. Coast Guard commander says boats and barges are having a tough time getting up the river, and that's causing serious bottlenecks.
But the culprit behind all that is not any enemy. Rather, this is the result of one of the most misplanned mega projects in American history, a project that is now costing billions every year in damages. A historic mess-up. In 2022, the Mississippi River suffered one of the worst disasters in its history. The water levels dropped by 11 feet, triggering a series of catastrophic events. Barges that fueled America's economy sat still in the water, stranded and unable to move. Meanwhile, in Louisiana, the drop in water levels allowed seawater from the Gulf of Mexico to creep in, cutting off the supply of fresh water to hundreds of thousands of homes in Louisiana. The damage wasn't just limited to America's economy and the welfare of its people. Nature became a victim too as the crisis left its mark on the native species in the region. But this wasn't a solitary occurrence. Rather, the same phenomenon happened the next year and has continued to occur every year since then, with the most recent drought occurring in 2025. However, this yearly disaster isn't the work of nature. Rather, it is the product of human intervention trying to rein in a natural powerhouse that was never meant to be tamed. After all, the history of the Mississippi River goes far beyond our own. During the last ice age, about 14,000 years ago, the melting of the glaciers and the subsequent movement of the resulting water were what formed the Mississippi River. And since then, it has been a key partner of humankind. For thousands of years, the native people and tribes used the calm flow to travel, to trade, and to connect their communities. The very name of the river is a variation of Mississippi, its original name in the Ojibwe indigenous language of North America. When the French explorers set out to map these waters in the 16th century, they realized the importance of this lifeline that was powering civilization. Whoever controlled this key route would control the Americas. Then, in 1803, the Louisiana Purchase occurred, which saw the size of America nearly double, just so the access to the Mississippi's mouth could be secured. A worthy purchase indeed, since once the steamboat era began, America made full use of the natural highway created by the river to transport goods and people across the states. Cotton, coal, timber, grain, all the things that drove the economy at the time were carried on the shoulders of these waters. It was the economic heart of the region, creating wealth and plenty. Up until now, humans were profiting from the natural highway they have been blessed with. On top of that, they were benefiting from its water, using it to quench their thirst and water their farms and cattle. But like any natural force, the Mississippi also acted up on occasion. And in 1927, it acted up like it never had before. An interesting fact about the Mississippi River is that it drains nearly 40% of the nation's area. That means if the volume of the ice melting and rainfall is too much, it can easily flood. And in 1927, the river flooded to unprecedented levels. It devastated several regions. From homes, farmlands, and roads, nothing was left. 500 people lost their lives, and 630,000 were directly affected. The disaster became one of the worst in American history. Damages reached the $1 billion mark, which in today's money translates to nearly $14.5 billion. Meanwhile, large settlements were displaced, people lost their homes, and were forced to migrate. The event became known in the annals of history as the Great Mississippi Flood, and it left a mark on the people, which became a catalyst for another disaster. You see, after the flood, the American people realized how vulnerable the lands around the Mississippi River were, and seeing all the damage and suffering, they decided to never let something like that happen again. The government decided the best path forward would be to rein in the Mississippi River. What began as a cooperation between man and the river had now turned into a need to control. The Army Corps of Engineers was deployed to begin work on a massive project in the 1930s. Their aim was simple: make the Mississippi flood-proof and make it even better for transporting goods. The Army Corps must be applauded since they fulfilled that mission spectacularly. They built dams, locks, and hundreds of miles of levees. The banks of the river that were once natural banks were, for the most part, turned into sturdier pathways made of concrete or mud. The results were everything the government wanted and more. The dams and levees could hold back even the biggest floods by containing and releasing water to manage the flow of the river. A disaster like the Great Flood wouldn't be a looming threat anymore. But that wasn't the only thing these engineers had achieved. They straightened out the bends of the river to reduce the travel time for barges and cargo vessels. The narrow parts of the river were widened to allow more vessels to pass through. Not only that, but since the flow of water was now carefully controlled, the river could be used year-round for transporting goods. By doing all that, the engineers were able to boost the economic output in the region by billions of dollars. For a while, the entire project clearly seemed like a resounding success. Little did anyone realize at the time that in the process of bringing the river under their own control, humans had made a huge mistake. The river that humans had relied on for thousands of years was now starting to quietly die off. A river going away. The slow strangulation of the Mississippi River was, for the most part, silent and unseen. For the longest time, the engineers, busy trying to control the river, did not see the damage they were doing. It was only decades later that we are now experiencing the consequences of these actions that were done in good faith but were ultimately flawed. You see, over the time that the Mississippi has been so heavily modified for human benefit, it has been displaying some rather concerning symptoms. The water levels that naturally drop seasonally have been dropping more and more regularly every year. At first, these drops were minor, but they have kept on increasing. Until in 2022, things came to the extreme. On 17 October 2022, the gauges used to calculate the water levels of the Mississippi River showed that it had hit minus 10.79 feet. That's the lowest it had gone since the National Weather Service began recording the water levels in 1954.
In the nation's southern half, that's bad news for the Mississippi River, whose levels are at historic lows.
It was an unprecedented drop that rang alarm bells for the experts. Cargo vessels that used to run along the river now sat stranded. There simply wasn't enough water there to keep them buoyant. Farms that relied on the river to water them suffered heavily. People didn't have enough drinking water. It was a national crisis. Water had to be brought in from alternative sources to meet the demand. Now, the experts were realizing the harsh truth. The Mississippi was drying up, but this was only the first of many yet to come. In September 2023, the water levels dropped to 10.26 feet. In 2024, the Army Corps triumphantly declared that the drought was over, but during the summer, the water levels dropped all the same. More recently, the pattern has again repeated in 2025. But what has caused this recurring tragedy? Well, it is a mix of nature and human intervention, creating the worst possible scenario for the river called America's lifeline. Well, it's a combination of human greed and nature's unpredictability. Droughts are a somewhat common occurrence for a river that covers such a large area as the Mississippi does. More than normal temperatures combined with less than normal precipitation create an extremely dry environment. There is no rain, and in turn, a critical shortage of water that affects the rivers directly. The high temperature doesn't just make the soil dry, it also makes it thirsty. That means that water from natural sources that would normally get absorbed by a slight bit by the land, and the rest of it gets drained into the river, gets completely absorbed by the parched ground. Very little of it makes it to the stream, and that reduces the water levels overall. And then there is the seasonal aspect of things. Mississippi isn't some artificial aquifer running at the same speed and volume throughout the year. During different seasons, the flow and volume vary. Generally, the river declines during fall and winter due to the reduced rain and colder temperatures, slowing down the rate of snow melting. This is the normal behavior of the Mississippi. But in recent years, this ebb and flow has been coming weeks before the normal timeline dictates. Now, that may seem like a small difference, but for a river this large, it is the biggest herald of disaster. An earlier ebb and flow means that later on, the water levels will drop even harder than they usually do, which is exactly what has been happening since 2022. Now, here is the thing. These kinds of inconsistencies in the river's flow, these droughts, these spikes in temperature, all these have been happening ever since the Mississippi formed thousands of years ago. But as far as our records go, nothing like these droughts of 2022 to 2025 have happened before. So what is really boosting the effects of disasters? The answer is human activity. All those changes that humans made to the Mississippi proved beneficial for trade and commerce. Sure, they even held back the flood. But in the process, they had quietly created conditions perfect for making a drought 10 times worse than it should be. Take the levees and flood walls, for example. These were built to contain the floods, sure, but by confining the river to narrow channels, it prevented the proper spread of the water into the floodplains that line the shores of the Mississippi River. An important thing about these floodplains and wetlands, they are basically nature's storage tanks. Water enters them from the river when the levels are high. The ground holds the water and slowly releases it back into the river over time. But now, since the walls of the Mississippi are solid concrete for the most part, that isn't happening. Instead of spreading into the wetlands, the water rushes down the stream and out to the sea. Very little of it is being stored for the dry seasons, which means worse droughts when they happen. And then there is the channel straightening that took place during the rerouting of the river. Engineers worked day and night to make sure the river provided the most optimal route for shipping vessels to travel. This saved time for cargo transportation, sure. But that straighter and smoother pathway also meant that the slope of the river and the speed at which water rushes out have increased. That further reduced the water storage capacity of the river and made it so the water that did enter it flowed out way faster. Quicker drainage like this makes droughts significantly worse, and there is the whole dredging issue. To keep the Mississippi operational, engineers regularly dredge the river, making it deep enough and uniform enough for vessels to traverse. Now, of course, rivers naturally aren't built to follow some specific depth standards, so by messing with this metric, it creates an unstable condition that affects the river's flow. So what's the end result of it all? Well, these artificial alterations have created regional variation that seriously debilitates the Mississippi River. It could be a full-blown crisis going on in the lower parts of the river due to water runoff, and on the upper parts, everything is going fine with normal water levels. Think of it like this: the entire river has become a drain pipe where water has no place to collect naturally or be accumulated for the dry season, and this mistake has some very serious consequences. Who pays the price? When droughts like this happen to the Mississippi, the biggest victim ends up being nature. Many people don't realize it, but this watery highway that's surrounded by urban cities along its routes is also a key component of the region's ecosystem. The Mississippi River Basin is home to over 100 species of fish. Additionally, it serves as an entire corridor for the migrating American waterfowl population that relies on this river to survive. Add to that all the other species of animals that rely on these fish, waterfowl, and mussels for survival, and you begin to get the picture. Since the Army Corps built so many dams and levees, water tends to stagnate in some sections. That results in increased temperatures, reduced oxygen levels, and bacterial growth. This tends to create the perfect environment for algae growth, which, when in too much abundance, can kill off other key species rapidly. And in the sections of the river where the flow is increased due to artificial causes, things tend to be even worse. Exposed sandbars become a huge hurdle for migrating fish and waterfowl, while also dividing habitats and mutually reliant species. But the worst happens near the Gulf of Mexico. Here, things tend to be somewhat different. Normally, the Mississippi simply dumps fresh water that has traveled from the inland regions of America right into the sea. It's a one-way transfer system. But in the last few years, the system hasn't worked as it should. When water levels get low, the seawater begins to flow into the river. It's not a full-on reverse flow. Instead, the seawater pushes in as a heavier layer, pushing through into the lower part of the river, like a wedge sliding across the riverbed. The results of this phenomenon are devastating. Regions that have had fresh water flowing through them for thousands of years suddenly have to deal with salt water. The wildlife, for the most part, is unable to put up with the sudden change. Animals either migrate, lose their habitat, or simply die off. Meanwhile, plant life gets completely destroyed in every part of this salt water. Because of that, there has been a major shift in the marsh communities that persisted here for hundreds of years. The entire ecological dynamic in these regions has been permanently shifted, and wildlife has suffered the most in the process. But at the same time, it's not like humans haven't had to deal with the consequences. Millions of people along the Mississippi River rely on it for their water needs, and when salt water begins flowing in, this water supply becomes undrinkable. That's millions of Americans losing easy access to one of the most basic of human needs. Water had to be brought in on barges to meet the demand. But this is only the tip of the iceberg, because these artificially magnified droughts don't just affect nature and residents, they also hit America's wallet. The Mississippi River helps move 90% of America's agricultural exports. That's corn, wheat, and soybeans, all being brought from farms across the U.S. to be exported to other countries for huge profits. This is why the Mississippi River is often called America's conveyor belt. And when the water levels go down, this conveyor belt comes to a complete halt. All that revenue is lost. And then, there is the other booming industry that comes to a screeching halt during the dry season: tourism. River cruises, fishing tournaments, and outdoor recreation. The Mississippi River hosts all of that and more. And combined, these generate billions of dollars in revenue and create hundreds of thousands of jobs annually. With no flowing river, none of that works either. Most scary of all, however, has to be the national security risks involved here. It isn't just cargo that is transported over these waters. It also helps move coal for power plants across America, steel for manufacturing purposes, and petroleum to be sent to refineries. When these industries are affected, it puts America at a huge risk. National defense and, critically, electricity generation get severely compromised, leaving the country vulnerable. For some, however, the risk is even greater. The Mississippi predates the formation of the United States. It predates even the British and the French. Many native tribes have a close spiritual and cultural relationship with the river, and as this historic companion to these tribes is eroded away, it threatens the culture and way of life of these people. The Mississippi is an intrinsic part of America as a whole. It links to the nation's economy, way of life, culture, and ecology. And when this vital lifeline gets affected, its effects are felt all across. For something so important to its survival, America must do something. The big question then is, what will America do? The answer to the question of the Mississippi River crisis is complicated and very, very expensive. And that's because it isn't just about fixing one huge issue, but rather about fixing several different problems while also keeping the cargo moving and reversing the damage already. When it comes to short-term fixes, the Army Corps has mainly been relying on dredging. Whenever drought hits, the engineers tend to deploy an army of dredging equipment to constantly remove silt and mud to keep the channel deep enough for vessels to use. But here is the problem. This is just a temporary fix, like slapping a bandage over an open wound. Sure, it keeps the cargo moving, but in the long term, this alone won't be enough as the conditions keep on getting worse. Thankfully, though, the engineers are working on several strategies to make things right in the coming years. And the first step in these plans is monitoring and forecasting. Sensors and facilities across the Mississippi River keep a close eye on water levels, flow rates, river stages, soil moisture, precipitation, and drought signs. This does two things. First, it provides useful data on the patterns that the river is going through over the seasons, and that will help us figure out what steps can be taken to fix the problems it's facing. Secondly, it helps forecast droughts before they become a problem. This allows for effective drought response thanks to the advance warning. Routes can be planned out weeks in advance, water supply plants can be prepped for the shortage, and farm owners can be informed in advance on what's about to happen so they can make arrangements for water supply during the drought. Most importantly, it helps the operators come up with the ideal reservoir management approach to keep the water levels within the acceptable range by releasing or constricting water from dams. But being on the defensive isn't viable long-term either. Experts are also taking direct steps towards reservoir management reforms. In the past, the reservoirs stored water during wet seasons, preventing floods, and then released it periodically over the year. But that presented one huge problem. The reservoirs, which were being discharged without much thought for the long term, would run dry by the time the dry season is in full swing. So, when a drought hits, there isn't much water in reserve to make up for it. Now, the engineers are moving towards a more adaptive approach. They intend to time the reservoir release in such a way that during droughts, downstream flows can be replenished more effectively. This is especially good for critical seasonal timings, like when grain shipping is at its peak productivity during the year. While all that is great for saving the economic side of the matter, experts are also taking steps to ensure the natural balance of the Mississippi River is restored. And to do that, they are focusing on the Watershed Restoration Program. This program involves the restoration of wetlands, backwater channels, and forests so that the old conditions of the river that naturally held water and released it to maintain sufficient flow can be regained. If this is achieved, nature could make a complete comeback in these regions. The vegetation could get restored, animals could return to their sanctuaries, and the ecological balance that was maintained here would be restored. Now let's talk about agriculture. One of the most effective ways the government is helping farmers save the Mississippi River is by promoting practices that reduce soil erosion, decrease nutrient runoffs, and increase the use of organic matter over non-organic alternatives. This will help farmers by letting their land retain more water, while also helping improve the water storage capacity of the region's wetlands overall. Though the uptake on this has been less than ideal, it is still a solid approach towards a mutually beneficial solution to the problem. Another important hurdle the engineers are pitting against is the saltwater intrusion. In the past, they have solved these issues through temporary fixes like building low walls that prevented the heavier seawater from getting into the river, while also allowing fresh water to easily flow off. The problem with that has been that this solution has proven ineffective on occasion. Multiple times these walls have been overflowed, allowing seawater in. So, a more permanent solution being employed is permanent barriers that will be more effective at keeping the seawater at bay, in combination with rerouting projects that will allow the river to be rerouted at critical times to prevent contact with seawater. Plus, the government is equipping the water plants in the affected areas with reverse osmosis equipment. This will allow even saltwater to be turned into freshwater for use during intrusion events in case of a drought. Now, planning all that is great, but deploying these projects is another thing entirely. The Mississippi River spans many different states with varying priorities. Not all of these states have the river at the top of their investment charts. So to really get down to it and fix the problems plaguing the Mississippi River, it would take coordination across the region, with everyone focusing on the bigger picture. Easier said than done. And then there are the hidden costs of all these solutions. Reservoir release times being modified will affect hydropower generation cycles throughout the year. Wetland restoration will cost productive farmlands being taken out of commission to make space. Building barriers against seawater means spending money to protect against droughts that may not happen for decades to come. Money has been tough to come by too for the project. While the projects have been approved, the funding tends to vary year to year as political focus shifts. And to make these ideas a reality, it will take consistent funding for years to succeed. America is at a crossroads, and what route it takes, only time will tell. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next one. Make this more concise and change the phrasing to seem less like the intro.